The account of Jesus' baptism contains a few differences between Matthew and Mark. According to some critics, the differences in these accounts are due to crafted theology and prove that Mark came first. But is this true, or is a theory driving the facts? The methods of Markan priority theorists might be illustrated by this comment from one of them. The creative energy expended by the likes of this critic in coming up with such pie-in-the-sky explanations and motivations for simple differences in storytelling are highly reminiscent, in my view, of the sort of conspiracy proposals we find behind... well, yeah. It's also beside the point. As I've explained in other venues, when properly understood in light of Semitic anthropology, Mark isn't saying that someone who came to be baptized was being cleansed of sin. Rather, they were making a pledge showing that they were already clear of sin. And if Jesus was sinless, then he was certainly eligible for John's baptism. Let's nevertheless address the views of the critics one piece at a time. It's here where we find what is rightly identified as an assumption of adversarial relations between the synoptic authors. Matthew spots a problem? How do we know this? We don't know this. It's simply assumed that whatever differences Matthew has from Mark are due to deficiencies that Matthew perceived in Mark. But it's not a problem at all. Apart from what I mentioned earlier about the correct role of baptism, the sinlessness of Jesus is an established teaching in the writings of Paul, the book of Hebrews, the epistles of Peter, and the epistles of John, and these are generally recognized as early and authentic even by the most stubborn critics. So we see the doctrine that Jesus was sinless was taught quite clearly and unequivocally within 20 years of his death and resurrection. Few believe that Mark or anyone else simply invented the account of Jesus' baptism by John for the reason that it supposedly causes the very dilemma the critics allude to. Yet in spite of the fact that Jesus was baptized by John, somehow Peter, Paul, and the rest came to decide that Jesus was without sin. So what does this mean? It means the so-called dilemma already existed when Paul and the others wrote their epistles. But the critics would have us believe that this so-called dilemma sat around for 30 to 50 years before Matthew slapped his forehead in amazement, recognized the problem, and at once corrected Mark's version of events with an extra cameo by John the Baptist. The answer to all of this is actually that even in Mark, the problem doesn't exist. Mark here makes it quite clear that John's baptism is for the forgiveness of sins, as we all agree. But then move on to this part. In the context of the gospel, this verse is clearly supposed to allude to Jesus. Jesus is someone greater than John, more powerful than John, someone so important that John isn't even fit to tie his shoes, and someone who baptizes with the Holy Spirit. Who could possibly exercise such control over the Holy Spirit as John exercises over water? Can someone with sin be given such enormous control over the Holy Spirit? Of course not. And so it is that the sinlessness of Jesus, and the fact that he did not come to be baptized because he needed it, is clear from the very beginning in Mark to anyone who bothers to read what the text is saying. If that's the case, there's no reason to think of Matthew as fixing anything in Mark. But then you may ask, why would Jesus come to be baptized by John in the first place? The purpose is clear from the divine voiceover that follows. The Father wanted Jesus to be baptized out of obedience, and the reason Jesus did that was to set an example for others to follow, like he did in the foot washing episode. This is a good example account, but it isn't laden with the theological freight that the critics think it is. And the far more likely reason for John's reaction is that he knew his honor status was below that of Jesus, not because Matthew is correcting some problem with Mark's Christology. That leaves us with no reason to think of Matthew's version as a later correction of Mark's earlier version. But we still have 2 more examples to go. See you next time.